Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Tony Quintana, Plant-Based Eating Program Manager with Animal Protection of New Mexico. Tonight, we're honored to welcome special guest Xavier Barraza. Xavier is a self-identified young man of color born in the South Valley of Albuquerque and stewarding a cattle ranch with his grandparents and family. He identifies as multiracial, Hopi, Mestizo, Chicanx, and German. Xavier brings over 10 years of experiential knowledge in popular education, positive youth development, and organizational development. As a young man of color, he co-founded Together for Brothers, an organization building the capacity of young men of color to shape systems and self to work with and for them. In late 2018, he served as coordinator for the Health and Healing Justice Program, forwarding a culture of decolonizing health and healing through self and collective care, restorative justice, and plant-based eating. His passions include the imaginary, degrowth, cognitive justice, democratic autonomy, social ecology, rock climbing, being in the sun, and engineering of self. So welcome, Xavier. Thank you for being with us.
I'm blessed. Thank you so much, Tony.
And I see you're out in the sun doing a lot of those things right now.
Yeah, I'm out here just acknowledging the land I'm on. I'm here, what's now called Jemez, but here on indigenous land, Pueblo land. So honoring that aspect of the place I am right now.
Nice, thanks for that. So real quick, before we dive in the conversation, just for those who haven't been able to join our previous webinars in this series, I want to share a little background information and a few definitions to help frame our discussion. In this Intersectional Veganism Webinar Series, we're exploring some of the ways that being vegan helps support other forms of activism and why it's important for animal rights activists to actively support other social justice movements. We are looking to deepen our understanding of what it means to stand in solidarity with those fighting to end systemic racism. So whether you're an animal rights activist or engaged in other social justice initiatives, thank you for joining this conversation, as this is a space for all of us to learn together. So real quick, a couple definitions, how we define veganism when we're talking about it in this series: as a way of life which seeks to exclude as far as is possible and practicable all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals. That could be for food or other purposes, and there are many ways to embrace vegan living. Tonight, we're talking about plant-based eating and following a plant-based diet, so that's kind of one layer of that. And then with intersectionality, describes the interconnectedness of seemingly disparate forms of inequality. Intersectional veganism left that definition open. We're going to define that, together. Everybody watching and listening in could come up with their own definition of what that means, right? So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get into the conversation. So kind of just to start off, Xavier, if you could just share what motivated you to adopt a plant-based diet.
Motivated me, I would say that
or just kind of where'd you learn about it?
Yeah, I would say the first time I ever really started doing plant-based or kind of vegetarian, I guess, was the start. Was when it was right after actually I had left my home when I was about 20 years old. My grandfather had just passed, Joseph Garnand, and I left the house, and I actually at that time was kind of wandering a little bit, and began working on some environmental work. And I met a good friend of mine and an older brother who I still am in very good relationship with, Charlie Bennett. He's also a doctor by trade, and he was also vegetarian. And so he started introducing me. He's half Caucasian, half Korean. And so his Korean side, he cooked a lot. He cooked a lot of really great food, nourishing food, and also very affordable food. And it was vegetarian. And so he's the one who taught me. He introduced me to tofu. He introduced me to not only tofu, but other forms of great forms of protein, how to make affordable and healthy and hearty meals, lots of soup. We ate a lot of soup whenever I was living with him. I would say that overall, I had ate vegetables, especially kind of where I grew up, calabacitas, you know, beans, chile, things like that. Of course, corned bean and squash. But Charlie kind of really opened the door on what it meant to live a vegetarian lifestyle. We didn't do dairy either. I think every now and then we'd use a little egg, but that was it. That was pretty much it. So it was definitely that time of my life, and there was so much more going on for me at that time that I could go on.
Mm-hmm. So it's mainly like influence from others teaching you kind of different ways to be healthy. And
that was the seed. Yeah, the seed was, and it was also it was affordable. You know, we were able to eat healthy, and I learned a lot more than just about how to eat affordably. Things started emerging, right? It started with just that seed, but so much more started to happen. So, which we can go into later.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we're gonna get into a lot more detail. And then also, can you tell us about Together for Brothers?
Yeah, Together for Brothers was founded about 5 years ago. It's an organization co-founded by young men of color and adult allies, mostly adults of color, and we founded it 5.5 years ago or so. Myself and a big older brother of mine, Christopher Ramirez, we had both been in the social sector work or kind of nonprofit work, social justice work, community organizing work, and there was not quite an organization working to serve young men of color specifically, which I was at that time. I was around 20 as well, right? So there's a lot going on around this time when I was 19 or 20, around 20 years old, and there just wasn't an organization that specifically was serving young men. And there was an organization actually at the time, Young Women United. Many folks maybe watching this are familiar.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually did, first they housed us, right? We started there, and they inspired a lot of our work. But mainly we wanted to organize with one another as young men and older men of color. We wanted to really share our story and our narrative and our counter narrative as to what was happening, not only in Albuquerque now, but contextually and historically, across health. I mean, health, transit, I mean, you name it, right? We wanted to make sure that narrative was there for us and our families. And together, myself, Christopher, and other folks, you know, Hakeem, Kira, I mean, Monica, I mean, so many folks got together, and we just, they were willing to support, and we started cooking and holding circle. And we actually started cooking because we couldn't afford to buy food. So we started cooking, and I'll go into, you know, eventually the evolution of pretty much eliminating meat and most animal products from our meals when we're feeding dozens, you know, a dozen or more young men on a weekly basis, and really learning together about what that meant. But yeah, that's how it started. We wanted to do something for ourselves, for our community, for our families, and so it was very much a selfish, but yet selfless act at the same time.
Yeah. I've been, you know, I've known about Together for Brothers, kind of been on my radar, you know, I've connected with Monica, I've connected with Christopher Ramirez in the past. And one thing that just caught my eye from the get-go was just how intersectional, you know, Together for Brothers is.
Yeah.
And like, even it's sad to say, but there's spaces, you know, all male spaces that don't have toxic masculinity or layers of toxic masculinity. You know what I mean? And I
Yeah,
just
for
like
sure.
stepping in those circles. It's a whole nother experience, which is, you know, that should be the norm. But it's beautiful what you guys have created and how you talk about, you know, you talk about respecting everybody. You talk about, you know, being LGBT friendly. I mean, I could go on and on about how beautiful, you know,
For sure. No,
that's.
our work is grounded in racial and gender justice for sure. I mean, we're looking at what it looks like for us in our context to dismantle patriarchy. We're
Mm-hmm.
looking at, you know, understanding structural inequity, systemic inequity, you know, and that's what the line of work we were in before T4B was even around. You know, we were doing that in other contexts, but not quite in our own context, right? Like, what's in the context of my existence as a human being and my intersectionality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Talking about intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw, you know, really honoring her and her work,
Yeah.
is that we started approaching it from specifically the context of our story and our narrative and our collective narrative, because we each have a story, and then we form. I like to think a story kind of like the stars. If you think of each star as a story, and then the constellation is a narrative, right? So we make a constellation with our stories, and that constellation is a narrative.
All right, that's cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So what is your current role with them? Like, what are you working on now?
So right now, I'm a program coordinator. We have various. I mean, we're T4B is especially. Christopher Mears. I got to lift my brother up. He's really. He's one of those folks who knows how to organize. He knows how to communicate. He knows how to imagine where the dots connect. And so, thanks to him and a lot of the other elders and even a lot of the young men, all of our brothers, we've been connected to so much work, both locally and nationally and internationally. Right now, a lot of our work is focused around transit equity, health equity. We're working on bicycle programs, right? We have bike programs, and we're doing a combination of virtual and COVID-safe small groups. We're working on policy. I mean, we're doing, we worked with the city and other community partners on the fare free transit for youth during the summer. We're hoping to have fare free transit for everyone in Albuquerque by 2021, 2022, right? As soon as possible. Working with local legislators on that. We do a lot of racial and gender justice work, working with Tell Women United and a lot of other folks around that. We're doing language equity work and language justice work. We have multilingual programs. This fall, Together for Brothers is organizing in Dene, Dari, English, and Spanish. So we have 4 different groups of young men organizing in their native language. We're also working on organizational development, right? We as an organization, 85% of our staff, we have at any time 12 to 40 young men of color working with Together for Brothers on contract, getting paid. We're really shifting, changing the narrative around what organizational development looks like, who can develop organizations, right? Who has the competency, capacity, efficacy to do something like establish institution. And historically and ancestrally, we know that young people and all people were a part of that. More and more as we've come to like our contemporary place, right? And where we are now in kind of modern times, it's mostly like professionals and academics who establish institution and organization. And so, and those are 2 things that young people aren't. They're not professional and they're not academics because they're not of age. And a lot of other folks aren't, right? And then it goes into, class and race and all these other things. But I think the other thing we're doing is we're shifting narrative on what it means to share power, make decisions, and establish organizations. So we have young men who, and myself as a young man, right? We as young men of color and older men of color have been co-creating an organization now for 5.5 years. And from everything from organizational policy to program development, program implementation, program evaluation. I mean, everything across the board. It's intergenerational and multiracial, and in multiple languages even, right? We're developing what it means that T4B is. What is T4B?
That's huge. Yeah, there's so much, man. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And then
thankful.
Yeah. And you alluded to it earlier, but so you've made T4B all plant-based. So all the meals that you share and create together are plant-based. How did that unfold?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's so organic, right? It's so natural. I think that's one of the beautiful things that we learn from from the rest of the natural world. We are nature. That's one of the things I like to identify as I am nature, and this whole, we can go into that, right? The narrative of when nature was estranged, when we estranged ourselves from nature and separated ourselves from nature. That was one of the great ways for us to create a story on how we can exploit it, how we can feast on it even, right? If we think about feasting on nature. And feasting on one another. It started, myself, I was plant-based starting in probably around 2017, 2018. So I was probably 23 at the time when I officially became plant-based and I really started taking it serious. And we cook, and I was just, for a while, we didn't cook much meat in general anyway. But when we did, I wouldn't eat, and other brothers started not eating, we just wouldn't eat the meat. And it wasn't any disrespect. It was just like, hey, that's kind of how we are. And then, all the brothers started, just embracing it. Other brothers were like, hey, well, let's not eat meat. Like if brothers aren't eating, or, at first, then, well, no, we went from eating meat to then having a meat and non-meat option. And then we went from a meat and non-meat option to pretty soon brothers were like, all right, I'm down. Like we won't eat meat. Right. And I'm feeling good. And like brothers were saying, like, I feel light, right? I feel lighter after the meal, or I'm not as sluggish after I eat. Or, we just started talking about it. So it was real organic, real natural. Meat was probably one of the most expensive things on the receipt whenever we'd go shopping. So that's a big thing too. So it's pretty organic and natural. It's just that myself and then Luis Colunga, who was the Healing Justice Manager at the time, he also became plant-based, and he still is as well to this. But then a lot of other brothers started taking it on, in their own way and in their own space. And you mentioned whenever it's practical, or it's able, and we know we have families that surround us with a meat eating culture, and there's a whole context to that, both indigenous and then also colonized, and so it's a complex thing, but it was pretty natural and organic on how it happened, and it was mainly about embracing one another and just finding ways to work around it and feeling healthier and embracing a new.
That's awesome. You froze a little bit towards the end, but I think I heard most of.
Sweet. I'm gonna go closer to the Wi-Fi.
Yeah, it's really cool to hear how it unfolded like that, because in a lot of spaces when I go in and talk about this or teach about it, there's a lot of pushback and a lot of like, people just aren't open to it for whatever reason, and it's really hard to get the message across. Whereas here, like in this respectful space, it just unfolded naturally. And then all those things that you were talking about, those are the things I try to tell people, like you'll feel lighter, you'll feel better, it'll be cheaper, meat is the most expensive thing, but it's cool how like the brothers could just learn that naturally, right?
Yeah. And there's compromise, there's meeting each other where we are, so some brothers would compromise by not eating meat, and then sometimes if needed, sometimes you eat a little. I mean, this is for me, right? I eat a little bit out of communion, just to show that it's not about putting someone lesser or being better than someone else. It's just about really trying to co-create a world of unity and of care and of humility and of compassion. And so I think that has gone a long way as well, right? Because when Luis and I weren't eating meat, we weren't telling the other brothers mean or nasty things, because they're eating meat, because then that would take away our brotherhood and our bond. So we would still be kind and compassionate and not, and uplift each other, even though we were at the same time showing another way of life, And so there's definitely compassion for both sides and for everyone, which was shared.
Yeah, I think that's important. There's a lot of vegans that refuse to share a meal or, sit at the table with people who are eating meat. And, sometimes it's like, that's not helpful or effective. Like clearly you two had a big impact on everybody else, by taking a different route. And so that's important to think about. And like you said, all the layers and things that, play into where we all come from with our food.
For sure.
Yeah. And I remember it was cool when I got to come and, have, cook and have dinner with you all, and just like seeing these young men that knew how to chop vegetables and knew how to prep food, and, like they knew their way around the kitchen, and they knew what different vegetables were. Like there's beets, and it's not like super foreign to people, like that was just amazing to see. Like I saw like clearly, like this is legit, this is real, like, it's not like you're just trying it out. Like the brothers are really into this.
It's a cultural thing now, it's part of the culture is what we're doing. We're weaving it in. We're weaving it into our blanket.
Yeah. So, let's go a little deeper if we can. I mean, from your perspective, how, just some examples, how does systemic racism impact our food choices? That's a big question on that.
It's big, but it's pretty blatant, I mean, I go to the Smiths if I go to the Smiths in the South Valley, or if I go to the Smiths in what they call a ghetto Smiths, I mean, the vegetable variety is way less than if you go to the one on the east side. So right there, you know, and then we can know who lives there, right? So by zip code, we know by zip code how long you live, right? They say if you live in the South Valley or particular parts of Albuquerque, you live 7 to 12, something like that, right? 7 to 12 years less. And you know, that's not just our food, but all these other things, our water, our land, our everything, you know, our air. And there's a lot of folks who have been working and talking about that environmental racism for a long time, like Los Jardines Institute, right? Really lifting them up, who were a critical part of my learning as well and my journey. But yeah, racism in the food system and how we eat. I mean, just our grocery stores are structured different. If you go, I remember last time I walked into the Smiths in the South Valley, the first thing you see when you walk in the door is pallets and pallets of soda, pallets and pallets of soda, and sugary things on the end of every aisle. And then you go to another Smith's in a little bit more wealthy part of town, right? And of course, wider part of town, we have to say it, right? I mean, at the end of the aisles is healthy snacks, or at times, you know, there'll be a combination, a little bit less, or there's just, you could tell by the way that it's one, maybe the institutions or corporations will say, you know, it's based on consumer choice, right? So they're putting what folks buy most often, most available to them. But it's also part of, we know that there's a whole science around how we structure our department stores and how we structure our places of consumption and even our advertisements, right? In a way that also affirms that and forwards that and further roots that into what is. So, I mean, that's one way. Is there any other, you were saying racism, can you restate the question again?
Just, you know, ways that systemic racism impacts our food choices.
I mean, that's one way. I mean, I think also it's talking about, I mean, there's so many ways that food choices and also like relationship to food, you know, it's like, I mean, we've really been estranged from our food. And I think that started with being estranged from our land, right? Is that we were really an agricultural, or not even an agricultural, but a land-based people. You know, and we had deep relationships with the land and with everything and all the other creatures that we shared the land with. And I think that was probably the start of estranging us from our food, was when we took ourselves out of the caring and the stewarding of our food, right? Is probably one of the greatest ways that's happened. And right now we know, I mean, I don't know if folks know, but like land ownership and even just home ownership in general in Albuquerque and across the nation is at an all-time low. Especially for people of color, but for all people. I mean, even now, I mean, there's been poor whites, especially organizing with people of color for decades, right? I mean, ever since the Patriots Party, I'm thinking Patriots Party, Black Panther Party, Brown Berets, Black Berets. I mean, they've been organizing for a long time. So I think it's also a great, it's not only about racism in our food, but racism connected to land, which is where food comes from.
Yeah, those are a lot of important things you bring up. You know, speaking from experience, purchasing a home, like we had to jump through hoops and like the stars had to align. You know what I mean? And like, it's not like, you know, I have a good job, you know, I've had steady employment, I've been blessed with all these things, and yet still it just doesn't add up because of, you know, other things, like of other factors. And it's just like, who would have thought it'd be so difficult to buy an affordable home, you know, with a halfway decent yard. And so I really feel that when people talk about that, like how hard it is to access, you know, owning land or, you know, having land. I you know, personally, I really feel that for sure.
Yeah.
And so, you know, kind of just in conversations with you in the past, you know, I've heard you talk about decolonizing your diet, decolonizing health. And so I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit like what that means to you.
I think it starts with understanding our story. That's a big part, right? And a lot of it has to come with grieving it. A lot of it comes back with sowing it, finding the seeds of it. But I think a lot of it starts, that decolonization starts, and some folks will say decolonization, and then some folks will say indigenization, right? So there's different ways, right? Decolonization being kind of like the negative, or like the taking away, and then indigenization being like the positive, like the reverse of that, right? Which is like what we're going towards rather than what we're working to undo, right? Like what we're working to do versus undo. And so there's a lot of ways to frame it, many stories to tell. But I think it starts with that, with understanding our story. And I think folks, will go back to the 1950s or the 40s, or maybe we'll go back even as far as Columbus. But I think, especially in our today's context, with everyone being multiracial and most of us not being of pure blood, all of us having mixed roots, connected to the West, and then also to maybe Latin America, or to the Turtle Island or the Americas, is we have to understand way farther back than that. We have to go back, 5,000-6,000 years into our history to really truly understand what it means to be decolonized. Decolonization started in ancient Sumer. We're talking a long time ago. Before Greece, before Rome, before all those things. Patriarchy and capitalism and the state was establishing itself. So I think that's where it starts with decolonization, is understanding 6,000 plus years of history to some lesser or greater extent, and leading up to some of the more recent past 500 or 550 years of our history of colonization here on this continent. And I think that's very critical. That's the most critical or recent history, but it goes much farther than that when we're talking about colonization and domination and colonialism. As an ideology and as a way of life. It goes back much farther than just 550 years. But these past 550 years have been incredibly important due to the exponential growth and just kind of the new colonial expansion that we've been seeing across the globe. But so I think, that's what I would start with, is story and history. And then we got to watch, right? A lot of folks are talking now, especially now with a lot of the racism and institutional racism being at the forefront, is understanding what history we're learning, right? Because we know, and I know, that the history I learned in my textbook was based on white supremacy, or whitewashed, or whatever we want to say, and also money washed, right? Because it's not just about, there's not just color, but it's also class and money, and those are directly tied, right? There's that intersection there. And so I would say that that's where I'd start, is really learning at a critical analysis of history, and of how we got here.
Yeah, that's deep, man. And it's just a lot of work. It's not just like, you can read one book and then, figure it out. But yeah, it's a lot to go through. So I appreciate you sharing all of that. And are there other ways that, all of this knowledge has impacted your diet? I remember you were talking about, you got me thinking about wheat, and like, should I eat wheat? Should I not? Is that, how does that influence your diet today?
How does what influence my diet?
Decolonization and just like that
Oh,
mindset.
I think, the beautiful part about our story is that there's stories that, some of us may want to avoid the story because it's so hard. There's a lot of harsh and hard parts of the story. But I think if, one of my, my partner was reading the Braiding Sweetgrass, a really powerful book by, I forget her full name, but she writes about beautiful stories. She's a half Native American, and she writes about beautiful stories of the history. And so I think that we need to lift up those beautiful stories as well, and that's part of it that's impacted my diet, is not only learning the stories of hurt and of pain and of grief, for all parties, but also learning those beautiful stories about where our food comes from, and the history, the story of corn, the many stories of corn, right? The many stories of bean and squash and the Three Sisters, and the stories of our land, and the stories of our medicine, and the stories of the herbs. And everyone has them. I even share with, thinking about, our Caucasian, or folks who identify as white, in many respects were forced or colonized as white, right? Because in many respects, Irish, Italian, all these people were not considered white at first. They had to be colonized. So I think even all folks, no matter who you are, if you dig far back enough, you will find beautiful stories about your land and about the food that was of the land that you belong to. I don't believe land belongs to us. That's one of the ways that they talk about indigenous, is like, how do you know if you're indigenous? Well, one folk says, do you think the land belongs to you, or do you think you belong to the land? And that's one way to think about it. And what does that mean? It's not just one thing to say it. Lip service is nice, but it's through practice. We don't just say it by our words. We say it how we wake up, from how we wake up and how we go to sleep. And every minute in between, every moment in between says whether or not we belong to the land or the land belongs to us. And so I would say learning those beautiful stories, and educating ourselves in those story and continuing to create story and share story about food. There's just so many beautiful narratives that really connect us to not only food, vegetables or the plant-based foods, but also to the animals, which helps with maybe not or participating in a new relationship with animals, of not just consuming them, right, but really starting to relate to animals in a different way, not just even as pets and ownership, right? Because that's even one thing around owning something, right, and owning an animal, but also around just understanding the story of correlating and co-inhabiting a space like the planet or the earth, with these other creatures, and really listening to story. And I think the native peoples of this land, and especially our Pueblo peoples, they have just the most profound stories that connect us to the animals around us, and it gives them spirit, it gives them depth. It's not just some furry, animal that's a stranger. It's something that has a deep story, and that's understood as a relative. And I'm not I'm not someone to speak too much on that, because that's not something I've dedicated much of my life force to. But I do know that those times that I have read about it and I have been shared with that story, it's changed how I've related to things. And so I think that's what this is all about for me around intersectionality, around veganism or plant-based diet, is it's about relationship and how we want to relate, not only to one another as human to human, but to human and non-human, and all the beings, sacred beings that we share the planet with.
You worded that was like so well worded. I'm glad, we're recording this. We're going to post it, because I need to reflect on a lot of that. And that's just some really good language. I feel like you just explained what I've been trying to figure out, because there's a lot of similarities, like with animal rights groups, and vegans. That's how they feel. Like, we don't own animals, a lot of people don't even use the word pet. They just say, my animal or my family member, or, they won't even say I have a dog. They'll say I live with a dog, or they won't say I adopted a dog. They'll say the dog adopted me. Like, it's about a whole different relationship with animals. And that's exactly what you're speaking to. Like, that comes from that ancient wisdom,
Yeah. And it's not clean cut, and there's a lot of, it's complex, and it's not going to be clean cut and easy, but if we can have grace with one another, and really just continue to try to live it out through practice, hopefully we come to a more closer, I don't believe in absolutes necessarily. So hopefully we just get a little bit closer and a little bit closer to what feels true, and having compassion for each other, so I grew up like I said, I grew up in a cattle ranch where, and an elder, my grandfather, who believed in owning land and owning livestock, and killing livestock, and I don't have no mal words for him, because that's a way of life, that he understood. And there's a lot of things he didn't get to work through in his life or get to understand in a different way. And so I still speak loving about him, no matter what he's done in that regard, because it's about having that respect, for him. And I know that by doing that, I don't cloud myself. I think I noticed that my ability to think is clouded or inhibited by being angry or by being overwhelmed by that emotion. And so I try to have as much grace and care for him and all my elders and all my relatives who still partake in that way of life or understanding. And hopefully by each day we come a little closer to something that feels better for us. So it's not clean cut, but it's worth working for.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate, what you're speaking to, that having grace for one another.
Yeah.
I think that's part of the compassionate lifestyle. Like, a lot of people set out to live a compassionate lifestyle, and I feel like, that's a big part of it. It's not just having compassion for the animals or making sure that your meal is compassionate, but how are you treating other people and other humans, and how are we working together to get closer to what feels good for everyone, like you said.
Yeah. And I'm someone who, has really learned that. I think of the past, I'm trying to think of this like golden age, some 10,000 years ago, when we were, hunters and gatherers, or maybe just gatherers, and going around eating just natural berries and foods. And, it may not ever be like that, but that doesn't mean we don't. Let us keep imagining, let us keep dreaming, let us keep that's the thing we need to let live, is our imagination, and don't starve our imagination from the beautiful world we can imagine for ourselves and for one another.
Yeah, that's really well put too.
So let us co-imagine this, even with the meat eaters, because that's what it will take. It'll take everyone for this idea to serve everyone.
Yeah, and if just want to throw out, if anybody has questions or kind of want us to expand on anything that's come up so far, please use that Q&A box or the chat, and we'll definitely, try to answer your questions as well. Xavier, I'm interested to hear what you consider to be traditional food. Like that word traditional is thrown around a lot, and I hear it in my family and in different spaces. And then, in recent years, I feel like we've been trying to unpack that a little bit more. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing that says to me is traditions are born and die every day. So traditions are born and traditions die. That's hard. Life and death, the cycle of life and death is something very deep that I'm still trying to really begin to understand how I relate to. But I'd say tradition is contextual, first and foremost, right? It's context, where I live, the time I live in, who I am, all these things. So I would say tradition is based on who we are and our identities, the environment we're in, and the history we've lived and how we've come to this point. And there are many, many traditions that exist. We have multiple traditions that we practice simultaneously. Traditions do not live isolated. It's like, they coexist. There's the word multiplicity and plurality, which are very key, I think, especially in our day and age. And so there's pluralism. There's traditions that coexist in the same home. A tradition of not eating meat and a tradition of eating meat, it's about finding. So for me, there's traditions. Tradition is something that we create together, and we create through practice. They're born every day, they die every day. Some are born, some die, and I think they coexist. Sometimes they coexist, and sometimes they're antagonistic. They attack one another. And so I think we need to think about how to make tradition where we start to. For me, that's what I got for tradition is that we create them.
That's a whole new way to look at it, because when talking to people, and maybe they're interested in switching to a plant-based diet or something like that, but then tradition.
For sure.
But I like what you said, that tradition is something we build together.
Yeah, and some and yeah, and they live in, yeah, it's hard to say what tradition is. I mean, if we're really talking about, plants and animals and non-human creatures, and beings on the planet, they even create tradition, right? There's tradition for the bears and for, hibernation, right? There's tradition for the plants and the animals. And so, we're all co-creating this tradition together. When the buffalo no longer roams, we lose tradition, because no matter what, whether they get, extinct because of the climate or because of the way we behave and we relate to them, and, we know about the story of the buffalo here in this land. So, we're not only humans create tradition, but all beings create tradition by their existence, by their very existence on the planet, and in reality. So I think that's one thing I would consider too.
Yeah, that's another piece of it for sure. And so I also wanted to ask too, in the previous webinars, the other people, we talked a little bit about how like the narrative around plant-based eating or veganism has kind of been taken, and it kind of feels like veganism has kind of been like whitewashed, or just the narrative has been redirected. Do you feel that in any way, or have you experienced anything like that?
It is and it isn't. It's one of those things, again, back to pluralism and multiple things happening at once. I would say that, we live in a predatory capitalist system, and so we can't knock it. Capitalism is going to do what it can to absorb any industry, anything that's of appeal to any human being. And the more people it's of appeal to, it will find a way to fit the niche. And so, yeah, of course, right now we have more plant-based foods and supplements and proteins and things coming out than ever before. And it's because the market's expanding. And so I think, that's always going to be there. As long as capitalism exists, it will find a way to get into every nook and cranny of our lives, because that's how it feeds off of. It feeds. One of the most beautiful things I've ever heard is Martin Prechtel, who's I believe he's half Navajo and he's half Caucasian, and he's a speaker, and he talks about how everything needs to eat. The spirit needs to eat. Humans need to eat. Plants need to eat. Animals need to eat. Well, capitalism needs to eat too. And the scary part about it is it's feasting on us. It's feasting. It's capitalism feasts all of the systems, though, not just capitalism, right? All the systems feast on something. They all need to eat, and so they're going to eat, and what they eat is through the market. And so yes, of course, as long as there's capitalism, it will find a way to take on all, whether it's veganism, carnivore, whatever it is. It'll find a way to continue to grow. And I think that that's a whole nother topic, is this idea of growth. And the folks who have been really analyzing capitalism have been talking about this idea of dominant growth, or like this pervasive growth, where we want everything to grow and grow and grow. And so I think that that's super important. And I follow degrowth, which is something you mentioned in my bio, because I'm willing to go somewhere to imagine what it's like not to have growth, not across the whole world, because there's some places in the world that may need to grow a little bit, but then there's places like New York, or there's places like Shanghai, or there's places that are huge, giant cities that are already way beyond potentially what they should have gotten as far as size, and they're cancerous. And so I would say, capitalism sometimes tends to be cancerous, and so it will do that. And I think capitalism feeds off white supremacy, because that's who it benefits the most, but it also benefits, in some respects, it's hard to talk about because it's no absolute. But there are people who are of color, or who present themselves, or people of color presenting, that also greatly benefit off the exploitation and the cannibalization of capitalism. And at least it looks like they benefit, right? It's an economic benefit, but then many would argue that there's a spiritual cost, there's an emotional cost, a social cost, and a mental cost, a psychic cost, a cultural cost to it. So I mean, it's not clean cut and dry, but I do think that folks with capital are going to make ways to feed the niche. If there's folks who want to eat plant-based, I think the best thing to do is localize as best you can, learn the knowledge of how to eat the way. If you want to be plant-based, learn how to eat that way and practice it, find community, co-create community. And if you don't want capitalism to thrive, then use less and less capital, grow your own food. And if I grow my food and eat it, capitalism doesn't like that, because there's no capital exchanged, right? There's no money exchanged when I grow and eat my own food. So that's the best way, I think, to take it on, is to find another way of life. And it's not easy, and it's not meant to be easy, because capitalism doesn't want it to be easy. It wants it to be easy to go to a vegan eatery. That's what it makes easy, is the exchange of capital. So I think that's the tough part.
Yeah. And so, shout out to some of the local vegan eateries that
For
do
sure.
use local ingredients, that
Yes.
keep the mind frame of keeping it localized as much as possible.
Yeah.
What are some of your favorite, foods to grow here?
But I love growing corns, bean, squash. That's a critical. Those are the three sisters right there, the tres hermanas, and I would say I like growing herbs. Rosemary, romero, mint. Of course, there's all the hierbas, right? And there's so many different plants. I mean, no matter where you are in the world, but especially here in the current day U.S. or here in Turtle Island, in the Americas, we have so many rich foods, so many foods that are enjoyed around the world started here. And so tomatoes, I mean, you got your salsa gardens, right? You got, just tons of different types of squash. Folks hear corn, bean, and squash, but there's tons of each of those. There's hundreds of varieties of each of those. So I stick to the basics though when I do grow, and things that'll store well. I like foods that store, because then I know I can have them for far beyond the harvest. And so that's also part of it. But then I love my berries, that don't store well. Maybe I make a jam, but I love raspberries. Blackberries, strawberries, and watermelons, melons, right? Melons. They have that piel de sapo, man, like the skin of the frog, which comes from the Tiwa land, right? From what I understand, right, is the Sleda people, right? They have that really great melon there that my mom grows with her partner there on a Sleda land. So I would say that Tiwa land. So I would say that those are some of my favorites.
Nice. Yeah, we've got 3 different kinds of squash growing in our backyard right now. I love growing squash because it's easy. I'm good at it, and mint too. Like those are good. When people are like, I don't know where to start or how to do it. Like I'm not a good gardener by any means either, but I try. But I
Yeah.
would recommend starting with those. Do you have any recommendations for people starting out, like what they should start with?
I would say start with whatever seed you have. Start with whatever seed you have. Take care of your seed, and be gentle with ourselves. Just as we should be gentle with the earth and gentle with the plant. Be gentle with ourselves. They will die, and I think that's the beautiful thing about being more and more part of the natural world and part of our natural self is we learn to have to let go. We learn to have to take loss, and for things to die. We see things die. And it's tough, but it's part of the cycle of life. And I think that that's a big part we have to understand. And so start with wherever you can and have grace and compassion for ourselves as we do it and we learn. And it's like being an infant, it's like learning how to walk. We have to have grace when we stumble and fall because we haven't really walked before, especially when it comes to growing food. Many of us have never walked and really lived life like that. And so we have to have grace and also honor the sources in our community. There's so many people, especially elders in the community, who have carried the tradition of growing food. And so provide that service and go support, a local farm or go show love, especially to the ones who have been there for a very long time. Show love and learn practice and the culture and tradition there. And that's always helpful as well. I'm very thankful, like I mentioned, Los Jardines, my uncle, my tios and my tias, and my mom and other folks who have taught me how to grow food because they carried the seed of knowledge, right, of how to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. Thanks for sharing that. And we had a question in the chat. You named a book earlier. They're asking if you could repeat the author of the book, Martin or Martin.
Oh, Martin Prechtel.
Martin.
Prechdtel. I just learned about him recently, again through from my partner, and wow, I mean, just there's not much about him online. He has a school, I think, somewhere here in northern New Mexico, and I don't know much about him, so I can't, I give respect for what I've heard him speak. But that the idea of things feasting was what I mentioned earlier about how everything eats, and spirit eats, we eat, plants eat, everything eats. And so, yeah, that's his name, Martin Prechtel. And I don't know much about him. I haven't read any of his books. He has several books, but beautiful words that I heard. The words I did hear from him were very meaningful.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, they said that they've heard about him from other people. He comes highly recommended. So I'll definitely check that book out too.
And that's his name. He has many books and some recordings online.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Cool. So we have about 5 minutes left. Just kind of wrap it up. Do you have any thoughts on what intersectional veganism looks like to you?
I really don't use the word vegan very often, because at times, not because it's not about what it is, but what it can be. It could be a polarizing term, and so, and that's that. And sometimes I just don't use it because I'm not willing to put the work in to really undo that, whatever it brings up for people. But I would say that it means finding our context and our identity and our locale. Sex, race, gender, class, all of our the land history, all the history we're at, and finding what that means in regards to a plant-based diet. I say plant-based because I find that that's pretty clear and straightforward, or pretty clear and forward, but at the same time open for interpretation, and open for inquiry. And so I would say, yeah, just intersectional veganism is going to be what we as the people make it. And like you said, right, it's going to be what we the people make it together. And there's going to be, in the time of capitalism, you know, those with additional capital or more capital, who shift narrative, especially media, are going to have an additional influence, because that's the world we live in right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, but that's true. But I think you shared a lot of wisdom, you know,
Yeah,
throughout this hour about how we can, what we can do as individuals,
for
you know,
sure. And
and like
collectives for sure.
building community. Yeah, as community, for sure. Yeah, thanks for that. That was really well worded too. So yeah, just closing, how can we support your work right now?
To support Together for Brothers, I mean, I would say if you have young men of color, or, you know, men of color in your lives, is to continue to shape them and be shaped by them, and find ways to, you know, to relate. Think about the ways we relate. Critically think about our relationships. If you are a young man, um, uh, really imagine more. Be willing to understand who we are, and to understand our story. To listen to our story. I'd say that. You know, we have a website and the whole gambit. You know, I've been on social media for 6 years. This is my first probably ever presence like this in a long time, for many years. I don't do much with media, um, but I would say that, you know, support the brothers. We have a lot of different programming happening in Albuquerque. Educate yourselves about what we're doing. If you'd like us to educate ourselves on what you are doing, then let us know. Send us a message. Um, and support transit equity, support public infrastructure. I think we're really about the commons. That's something we didn't get into on this webinar series, but it's about I believe in the commons, and I think we're going to reiterate that for our era and for our current time. But I believe in commonly owned goods, and a lot of people associate it with communism, but that's not quite what it is. And you know, that's a polarizing term, I know, but I think that the best way to support Together for Brothers is learn about our work. If you see us, say hello. If you see me, say hello. I will say hello back and introduce myself. And then, like I said, the online stuff will speak for itself as far as our work, and then the donation piece and all that type of stuff. But I think that the best way to support us is to um, understand our story and our context. And we're doing a lot of work across the board around social justice and racial justice and gender justice work. And so if I think build relationship, shape the relationship with us, and it'll go from there.
There you go. Yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, definitely reach out to me if there's any way we can collaborate, you know.
Yeah.
Keep me in mind.
Get involved in each other's lives, as they say.
Yeah, yeah, there you go. Likewise. Yeah, thank you again, Xavier. This was an awesome conversation. Thank you everyone for joining us. Recordings of these webinars can be viewed on our YouTube channel. Please share them with anyone who might be interested. The links will be sent out to everyone who registered. We hope that this webinar will keep this conversation going and generate further discussions and explorations on how animal rights and human rights are interconnected. So thanks again. Take care, Xavier. Have a good night. Have a good night out there.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Tony, and everyone. Um, and super thankful to be present with you. And blessings on your journey. Bye for now.